Good morning, everybody. Everybody knows me as Syed. So yes, my name is Mahmood Syed, but Syed to all my friends. I'm a principal lead and security architect within BT, and I've actually been working with BT Ireland now for well over 18 months, specifically looking after Ireland customers and helping them on the journey to actually reduce their risk, increase their security, look at their architectures, and help them with the whole management of what is cyber threat management, what is cyber risk reduction, how do they utilize services to actually protect their industries, to protect their data, to protect their money at the end of the day, because that's all about protecting revenue, for organizations. What I wanted to talk about today was some of the findings that we've had within BT, working with our partnerships with companies like KPMG, but also in respect to our engagements with customers, where we've actually gone in, interviewed those customers, discussed how they manage their security, etc. And I wanted to give you some of that feedback in terms of how you can help yourselves from an operational perspective, how you can actually be far more proactive in protecting your estates, but also the fact that you've got to have reactive management in place. I think everybody knows the kind of threats that are actually occurring within the industry worldwide. Hacktivism, criminal, nation-state terrorism, they all impact us one way or another. But what I wanted to do was kind of go through some of the elements that people should be aware of today in terms of threat landscape, how things have changed, some of the operational issues that customers are facing and actually feedback to ourselves, the kind of proactive measures that you can actually put in place just to deal with the basics, and also what reactive management organizations really should be putting in place. Some of the facts around how much it's actually costing businesses globally, in Ireland as well, directly related to things like DDoS attacks, cyber attacks, insider threat attacks, and it's costing us millions in terms of revenue, in terms of operational time it actually takes to resolve issues. I mean, the average time to fix issues that people are experiencing, well over 30 days. By then, in the vast majority of cases, the horse is already bolted. Data's been taken, compromised. You're now then doing a risk management crisis. And some of the actual cost of that it is literally in the billions now, in terms of the overall impact to organizations. But what people don't realize is that some of that threat is actually, as you can see from the bottom right, bottom left, sorry, employees, ex-employees. Insider threat is a huge area of gap that organizations just aren't taking as seriously as they should be. The kind of companies that have been hit, they're all household names, people like TalkTalk, Sony, etc. And recently you've also had big hits within Ireland as well, with the energy sector, with retail. Healthcare as well is a huge risk area, especially when you look at things like GDPR, people's personal data. It is actually mind-boggling how much impact cyber is actually having on spaces like Ireland, in particular over the last year, 2 years. I've got some stats here from one of the partners we talked to, which is Grant Thornton, around the types of activity they've picked up. So you've got the usual suspects there, that your viruses, etc. But what was interesting is at the bottom left of their circle there, they have DDoS attacks down as 2%. That was actually a stat from 2015, 2016. Last year, it was actually increased to over 10%. So it just means that that particular vector is actually growing enormously. And that's actually contributing to the actual damage it's having on the Irish economy. In 2015, 2016, their estimation was it was over 630 million euros. Talking to them recently, they're thinking that's actually in excess of €1 billion. So it's only growing, which means we've got to do things about it. And the headlines that you've seen in the press, with regards to the energy sector attacks, where people have experienced ransomware with Petya, with WannaCry, etc., they are only putting cyber threat higher and higher on the radar. But what is actually surprising to me is how much effort organizations are actually going to actually protect their data, protect their estates on a fundamental basis. You've got fantastic technologies like John was talking about with Darktrace, etc., which give you some really great intelligence, analytics information, what could actually be occurring in the state. But having those technologies are no good if you haven't done the basics. And when you see the volume of attacks like DDoS, I mean, last year there was over 500 gig, was probably the largest one we saw at the beginning of last year. That increased to over 800 gigabytes. And there was actually one instance where Dyn, who actually manages DNS servers over the US in particular areas, actually experienced a 1 terabit attack. One of the misconceptions about DDoS attacks is that they are volumetric only. Well, they're not. They're actually very complicated nowadays in terms of their sophistication and in terms of their packet loads. But you can actually put them into three areas. One being volumetric. Clearly, that's there to target you, to actually consume your internet links, consume your bandwidth, stop you doing any activity in the space. There's also TCP state exhaustion. That is actually compromising your platforms that are connected to the end of those links, overloading them. Things like your firewalls, your load balancers, your web servers. You can actually have that occur more often than you can sometimes your bandwidth actually filling up. And that's something that's growing more and more. I've seen a huge amount of attacks in terms of DNS, in terms of web servers getting compromised, data being stolen off those web servers. And the last area, which is really increasing hugely, is attacks directly against applications. So when you talk about things like your online banking or your access to your medical records, which you can get through your web portals nowadays, attacks against those environments is actually leaving them open to that data being stolen, that data being compromised. And that risk is actually only increasing with more and more companies now taking on board cloud services. So when you talk about cloud, everybody talks about things like AWS with Amazon or Azure with Microsoft. They may put some security controls there. There's quite a considerable amount of immaturity in the way organizations actually manage that security in cloud. But what a lot of companies don't realize is how much shadow cloud they're actually using. Services like Dropbox, Box, plus they may be using Salesforce, plus they may be using anything else, web-based tools, etc. The risk is no longer just an insurance to say, is my service available to the internet? Because now you've shifted your business into the cloud world. You've shifted it into a position where you're actually dependent as a company on cloud, on internet being available, on services being available. So you've got to put the right levels of protection into those environments. And on top of that, you've got the increased risks around services like email. Email massively has grown, especially in the phishing category, especially in the ransomware and the payloads that come through email. Malware itself, there's a huge increase in the amount of new malware variants out there. All of this is all contributing to a growing threat profile that is, one, very complex to manage, but also has to be managed one way or another. Okay? I'm sure people have seen this screen before with the ransomware and WannaCry. Scared an awful lot of people to death when they first saw that, thinking, what the hell do I do with this? Luckily, because of the flaw in the way it was actually written, quite a few companies that could have been hit to the point of actually going bankrupt were actually protected to some degree. But what was interesting from WannaCry is the actual amount of variance of ransomware attacks that actually came out after that. So things like Petya, GoldenEye, etc. And as you can see with that diagram I got from F-Secure, the growth of actual derivatives of ransomware has grown massively. What people are still doing is paying. What people aren't doing is actually taking measures where they're actually protecting their estates. So things like your patch management, taking backups, etc. Still fundamental flaws that people are not following in terms of simple processes that they could deal with. Some of the stats that were, publicized by organizations around, the impact of WannaCry. Officially, 400,000 plus machines were reported as being affected. Reality says that there's probably over 1 million that were actually in real terms affected, but they just weren't reported. People either dealt with them on a personal level or they didn't bother, they just refreshed the machines. However they dealt with it, but it was well over 1 million plus machines that were actually affected. 150 countries, including Ireland, was affected by WannaCry. It may not have been reported in the same scales as something like the UK, where things like the NHS was prevalent in the news, etc., but people were still affected. And mentioning the fact that the basics around patch management. Well, you know, Microsoft actually publicized that patch almost 3 months before WannaCry even hit. But simple processes around patch management on states just weren't being followed by companies. One of the interesting things that I've noticed with the retail sector is that a lot of them in their POS tools and their commercial tools are still using platforms like Windows 7 embedded. Now, up until recently, there were no real fixes for that, other than trying to lock that environment down, segregating it off. But thanks to partnerships with people like Palo Alto that we work with, they use a product called Traps, which actually can help protect that and actually can stop that payload actually occurring. But companies need to explore and invest in these technologies to get the most out of them to protect their estates, especially if they're stuck with actually having to utilize them. I think pretty much everybody is aware of the types of attacks that people can be subjected to, whether it's DDoS, ransomware, espionage, disruptive attacks, fraud, etc. What I don't see is organizations really measuring their risk management around their estates. They may have a pretty good idea of how they deal with things like operational day-to-day problems. But when you talk about instances like WannaCry, it was surprising how few organizations had proper processes in place. It was also surprising the amount of time and effort it actually took. So the more complex your environment is, the more at risk you are of not being able to resolve issues, and then the more cost it will come to. So you have to go through a proper risk assessment process, and that should be embedded into day-to-day culture. Some of the findings were, to me, quite shocking, and I still get shocked by some of the feedback I get. And these are based on interviews I've had, my team's had with customers. Denial. I actually had a billion-dollar company I was talking to only a few months back who said, oh, we're not at risk of DDoS. We're not a big name. People don't know us. We're not a Sony. We're not somebody who's high in the press markings. We don't need DDoS. Literally 3 months after I'd been to see them, they got hit. Guess what? They made a phone call and now want to look at it. There are those companies that actually go to the other extreme. They buy so many technologies that they embed in their environment, but they don't have the people with the skills, the processes, and the ability to actually manage them. And then they wonder why they're not protected. Some of those that go down those lengths have that false confidence. We're protected, we're really safe. But you can't be safe from things you don't know about. All you can do is manage risk in that space. And what you've got to be is in a position to say, okay, if we had these issues happen, what are we going to do about it? And another thing that I found quite interesting was that when you talk about hard lessons, when people do have an incident, and that incident is resolved at some point, very few people actually go to the next level to say, what's the root cause analysis? How can we improve things? How can we actually mitigate issues in these environments? And surprisingly still, when you talk about security and who's actually responsible for security within organizations, it really should come from the very top of the company. And everybody underneath that person should have responsibility for security. It doesn't matter whether they're the CIO, the CTO, the CFO. They may have a person called a CISO who may be responsible for the day-to-day regulatory management, compliance management, etc. But every single person in that organization has to have responsibility for security. And they should all be contributors in that space. And what I find time and time again, the CISO will say, well, actually, yeah, I know about that issue, but I can't get finance to pay for it because there's not enough budget for it. Or I can't get the technology guys to change their platform because they're embedded with a particular legacy version of software. Got to be far more proactive in how that is managed and raise those risks right to the top of the tree. And getting some of those basics right are fundamental. So, we divide those into the 4 categories we've seen out there. What are the basics? Well, has anybody actually looked at things like standards like ISO 27001? It tells you best practice management. Does anybody follow those processes? How are they embedded? Are you able to change according to your business and also change the environment you're managing according to where your business wants to go? So if you are launching new applications, how are you assessing those applications? Is it just from the point of view of functionality, or are you looking at it from the whole estate management side of things? And it's not just about the technology, because every single bit of technology should be backed up by processes, by people, by responsibilities, and it should be married into the overall business ethic, not just saying this is a great shiny box, it does wonderful things. Okay, but does it actually work for my business? Does it support me? And what I find time and time again is people try and do things in isolation. They don't reach out to their partners, their technology partners, their business partners, their communities. Some of the strong areas you do see that kind of visibility is the financial sector, because they do talk, they do say what's actually attacking the finance industry. But there are many, many other areas that are not doing that. And there's opportunity there, I think, to massively increase that spirit. Sharing actually helps an awful lot in terms of how you can actually plan your management. Why that's so much relevance is because if you look at where people are strategically going over the next 2, 3, 5 years, cloud is going to grow massively in terms of its utilization. People are taking advantage of infrastructure as a service, software as a service. But going to cloud also means that you're increasing your risk profile as to what vectors you can be attacked to. There's also a huge growth area in things like IoT, IOE, Internet of Everything, I actually call it. It's not just Internet of Things, it's everything. You know, the growth in terms of the technology that's actually embedded in organizations is actually huge when you talk about things that can actually talk to the internet. One company I actually spoke to said, oh, we don't have to worry about Internet of Things. We haven't got anything particularly that we worry about that's connected, like fridges, freezers. I said, okay, well, you've got a data center. What about your fire suppression systems in a data center? What about your UPS systems that you've got connected now? And then you look at organizations where they've got SCADA environments, maybe an oil company, maybe an energy company. They're now changing those platforms to be much more IP-centric. So they're now connected to your network. They are now at risk. You could see that by the Ukraine attack that happened. You can see that by the Irish energy attack that happened. There are so many vectors now that are in play, not just your IT technology, but it's any kind of technology you're actually connecting to your environment. So, when I was referring to earlier about what can you do, what are the proactive things you should be looking at? Well, I've made a list there. I'm not going to run through every single one of them, but just to run through some key ones there. At the very top, get to know your business. It amazes me how many people don't actually understand the full extent of the business they do. Where it's actually sitting, what it's actually utilizing, who their B2B partners are, who they're actually sharing data with, etc. Get to know what technology you've implemented. Have you checked it's actually fit for purpose? Does it actually meet your needs? Does it actually give you the control and availability that you need? Frameworks are hugely important. It's almost kind of why I repeated that line twice. Because I don't see frameworks utilized extensively well in organizations. Some people may look at ISO 27001, some people may start looking at NIST because it has some actually really good granular controls in terms of how technology should be configured. But as a baseline, people should look at things like CIS Top 20 or SANS Top 20 as people know it. It gives you a real relevant vectors of attack that people are focusing on, what are critical to their environments. And I can't under-stress how much time should be focused on areas like that and marry that to whatever you've got deployed within your environments. Big area of gap I see time and time again is the skills that you have within organizations, whether people are trained up with the relevant knowledge and skills. I've seen people who've been firewall administrators for 10 years. They've been told, go and deploy the latest generation boxes. And they don't have the knowledge to actually understand all the capability of those boxes, how they should be configured, how well they're being managed. Governance, having that maturity of organization, fundamental. I kind of covered some of that there. There are lots of companies out there that do things like ethical hacking, pen testing, red teaming. What I find with that is that people may do that as a tick box exercise once a year. Well, if you do an ethical hack test once a year, you've only got a point-in-time visibility. What happens when the application gets changed next month? Who's repeating that test on that application? So using ethical hacking as a testing process, pen testing as testing process should be embedded with change and should be revisited. A lot of companies are looking and investing in SIEM technologies, security incident event management, maybe also enhancing that with threat monitoring, where they've actually got active threat services. But the data they're collecting, very few I'm actually seeing going to the next level of actually analyzing that data, understanding that data, and measuring that against their estates. It's a huge amount of noise. A lot of companies I've seen have actually just taken that to tick a box to say, we do log retention. We've got records. If we have an incident, we can look back at it. But what about taking that data today and being proactive with what it's actually telling you and doing something about it? The same thing goes with reports. I see tons of reports where people have either conducted pen tests or ethical hacking tests, or have got reports from platforms like their firewalls. Very little activity occurs after that report's sent to their CISO. He may give actions to the technical guys and say, right, can you fix that vulnerability? Can you do that? They may do that on a tactical level in some instances where they've got big red risks, but that should be embedded again as part of the whole risk management cycle. And that's getting the visibility side. That does not cost huge amounts of CapEx budget to actually implement. That takes time, it takes personnel, and it takes people with the right knowledge and skills to do that. Controls that are embedded within organizations. I've seen far too many companies out there who've got policies, but they tend to be paper-based. They don't tend to be necessarily enforced. So a classic example, a company I went into not long ago, thou shalt not access sites that are to do with social media in their paper policy. Yet their URL filtering allowed them straight to Facebook, to LinkedIn, to whatever you could actually access. And I said, well, why haven't you married your policy up with your actual enforcement? Oh, we like to see what people are doing. Doesn't make sense. Patch management is another area. If you're going to do patch management, do it properly. Don't just think about your Wintel estate. Yes, Microsoft have got great technology there with WSUS, with SCCM. Windows, pretty easy to manage on a patch management basis. You just got to get on top of it. But what about your firewalls? What about your routers? What about your proxy servers? What about other things that you're running in the estate? Call management platforms. There's tons of platforms that have updates and patches that should be configured, should be looked at on a continuous basis. I talked about DDoS, so I'm not going to labor on that one, but you've got to look at having that, especially if you work in the cloud space. And then there's more subtle things that I've found where companies have invested in technologies like IPS, yet they never put it into IPS mode. They leave it in detect mode, and then they wonder why something was compromised. If you're going to put it in and you've had it there for 2 or 3 years, surely you should be moving into that IPS protection mode. Do some active blocking. Actually look at your rule basis, say, is it fit for purpose? And if you're going to change applications, that should be relooked at again and again. On firewall platforms, vast majority of next-generation firewalls have got UTM functionality. They're not just rule-based platforms. They've got malware detection built into them. They've got botnet detection built into them. They can link into other platforms like your SIEM, your alerting, etc., your logs. Very few companies I'm seeing utilizing that full extent of capability on platforms. And again, a lot of that is down to the experience and knowledge of the people that have bought them to say, how are we going to use this going forwards? A growth area I've seen massively, and we've experienced with a lot of companies out there, is they want to look at network access control. They want to know who's connecting into their environments and how they're connecting. They also want to get to that nirvana state of saying, well, I'm only going to allow authorized people. But you've got to start somewhere, and the starting point is getting visibility on what's in your estate. And when you look at things like the ransomware, endpoint is critical to environments. How are you managing your endpoint? How are you controlling your risk around that? One thing I've seen quite a big move to nowadays is moving away from point best-of-breed solutions. So traditionally, you'd go out and you look at, well, this is the best firewall, this is the best proxy server, this is the best AV. You actually, I think, get far more value now by looking at the whole ecosystem of what a vendor can potentially provide. And I think organizations should look at that, especially if they've invested heavily in particular platforms, whether it be Palo Alto, Checkpoint. Look at the full ecosystem. There's a reason for that, is because a lot of these partner vendors have actually spent the time to do the integration properly, rather than having to have an API that may or may not work well with a particular platform. And going past the proactive management, proactive, protection of the estate, you've got to have reactive management in place. The reason why, you cannot plan for everything. You can't control everything in your estate. And to have reactive management means you've got to have an embedded incident management process. You've got to have business continuity plans. You've got to have vulnerability management. You've got to have crisis management. Because ultimately, you may be in the press, you may be in the news. And time again, I don't see these areas formalized. If you're going to do anything today, get that on board and get people working on it so that you've got a formal team that actually manages these areas. I come here as BT, working with a lot of customers here. We've got quite an extensive portfolio of services that we provide, not just in the UK or Europe. We've got a huge capability in Ireland as well. That includes consulting services, it includes managed security services, it includes security intelligence. We work with a vast majority of the key leading vendors out there, but we are not vendor-centric in terms of being stuck with one particular provider. We're agnostic in that space. And what we'd like to be able to do is bring our consultative capability to organizations like yourself to help you on those journeys to protect your estates. Thank you. If you've got any questions, feel free to fire away. Got 5 minutes.